So thanks for giving me the opportunity just to speak about the African guidelines, expectations, and pitfalls. I will start by just speaking about Africa first. So African population is almost 16% of the world population. Consanguinity rates in many of the African countries, especially North and Sub-Saharan Africa, reaches 60%. According to an epidemiological study that was done by Professor Bousfiha in 2015, there was expected 1 million person to be living in Africa with inborn error of immunity. However, at this point, it's only 0.6% of the patients who were reported. And I appreciate now listening to Rabab and my other colleagues that there has been an expansion in diagnostics of inborn error of immunity in some centers to the extent of performing whole genome sequencing or whole exome sequencing, sorry. However, you see that other centers are still fighting in order to establish the resources for to diagnose patients with inborn error of immunity, as Anna has described. So in an effort in order to support early diagnosis of inborn errors of immunity and early management, Professor Bousfiha, the co-founder of the African Society, has been with the rest of the ACID board and a big team trying to create the A projects in order to support training of doctors in their home countries about inborn errors of immunity to support early diagnosis and management. There was also movement for African ACID schools to go from being general schools to specific schools in order to make people have a better understanding, for example, of B-cell immunity, of a better understanding of phagocytic immunity, so better training and better education. And this is just examples of some of the ACID schools that were created in 2022, and they are in 2021, and they are all online, and you can watch them on YouTube. But the main thing that Monica was thinking of, my colleague Monica Issa from South Africa, is that do we need to establish African guideline in order to really support the diagnosis of inborn errors of immunity? As you see, not all the centers have all the facilities to diagnose the patient. We have problems in Africa with endemic diseases, especially tuberculosis and other intestinal infections, and it is quite difficult and challenged to know if this is the infection or this is an inborn errors of immunity. So we thought of creating African guidelines that is adapted to Africa, that is that should support collaboration across African centers and exchange of expertise between inborn errors of immunity centers throughout Africa, and will allow referral for further management at dedicated centers in Africa or globally in other world-renowned centers. And what Monica has initially created is a task force, including African and international advisory board, facilitator, team coordinator, scientific chair, which is Monica, and chair of the African Inborn Error Working Party. The key ACID members were recruited for reviewing African inborn errors of immunity literature. So there was initially a literature search. Do we have this disease in Africa or not? How much of the patients has been reported so far? We were revising the ECID guideline, revising the inborn error IUIS criteria for diagnosis, and we made a structured document like a pro forma that is guiding doctors and African doctors about criteria for diagnosis, differential diagnosis, complications, how to evaluate the patient at the first visit, baseline investigations and samples, prophylaxis and treatment approach, and management of complication. And all of this was reviewed by an African Inborn Error Working Party group, and then for authorization, the pro forma should go to one of the members of the advisory group for final approval. And we have picked two of the important areas of immunity that are, I wouldn't say that they are commonly reported in Africa, but they might have been overlooked in Africa, especially they are like infantile colitis and autoimmune lymphoproliferative disease. There are other endemic problems in Africa, endemic infections in Africa that just can mimic ALPS or infantile colitis. And that's why we started with this guideline. And here I will show you the two guidelines that were established already by the African Society of Immune Deficiency and approved. And this is the first one for ALPS. So we have made some modifications in terms of the definition and the timing of when we should be investigating if a patient has chronic lymphadenopathy. So one in the guidance is like 6 months for ECID. We are trying to make it a bit earlier because we know that there are endemic problems that we should investigate, but then subsequently we need to do more investigations if these infectious diseases are no longer the etiology for this lymphadenopathy or splenomegaly or hepatomegaly. And we have also tried to look at the type, how can we establish a treatment algorithm for patients with ALPS. And it is important that we highlight in our guideline the importance of having multidisciplinary approach in management of the patients involving immunologists, hematologists, and rheumatologists. And we looked at the feasibility of immune suppressive medications and the data published on the treatment guideline for ALPS, and how can we safely give immune suppressive medications in our patients, and what's our recommendation about more vaccination, for example, for these patients. And we made, as you can see, an algorithm. I don't need to go through the algorithm, but we made an algorithm of suggested management for patients who had the diagnosis of ALPS. And then the next cohort is the patient with early onset inflammatory bowel disease. And in here we have added like red flags to say that there might be a possibility for important error of immunity, especially having autoimmune manifestation. Family history, of course, is important, but autoimmune red flags are tumors, autoimmune manifestations, having manifestation of HLH, and we looked at inflammatory markers, raised fecal calprotectin, and endoscopy. And then in order to support a way of how can we diagnose patients with early onset inflammatory bowel disease if they have an underlying important error of immunity, and I appreciate this is not covering everything, but we'll cover most of the cases anyway. So we established like what the doctors need to do in terms of full blood count, immunoglobulins, lymphocyte subsets, oxidative burst, and other functional tests in well-established centers, or sending these bloods to other well-established centers. And if there is a suspicion that there is a monogenic cause for inflammatory bowel disease, then you can contact the ACID or the Jeffrey Motel for genetic testing. And also, we established a guideline for management approach for these patients. Again, putting lots of strengths on the importance of multidisciplinary team approach, getting the immunologist, gastroenterologist, and dietitian together, and stepwise approach in management, flagging to the doctors that there might be, with the identification of monogenic causes, there might be targeted approaches in order to targeted therapies in order to manage the disease. And I would say that some of these therapies are already used for either inflammatory bowel disease, or they are used under rheumatological disease. They are available in our African country, not necessarily for management of important areas of immunity, but for other diseases. So it's just moving them to be used in patients with important areas of immunity. And then considering transplant, again, there is the discussion of the African Society Transplant Centers and international centers, and always thinking if a patient has refractory inflammatory bowel disease, then there is a potential also to transplant this patient. So in terms of the updates on the timeline, so we have a first draft for chronic granulomatous disease, for hypogammaglobulinemia, for MSMD, and in the pipeline there is the hyper IgE and EPESHET. And what is expected from having the African guidelines, of course, supporting early diagnosis and management is what we are aiming for, but also supporting the development of African registry where the doctors from different African centers are just putting all the data about their patients with inborn error of immunity in this registry. Again, Monica and Ali has done a lot of effort in order to create a steering committee and create an Excel sheet that I will show you later in order to support data collection using the African guidelines. The other thing that is expected from the African guidelines is to support the development of a research line across Africa. However, the challenges that I believe are there is the ability to produce the guideline in a timely fashion. So I would say that it took more than a year in order to establish these two guidelines, and lots of meetings every 3 months, a meeting in order to meet with the team who are writing the guidelines and the reviewers in order to get it done. So I think we need more personnel on the African Inborn Error Working Party to support this work. The second thing is the application of these guidelines across African countries. So I think it is important that we discuss the guidelines in the scientific platform. We need to publish these guidelines, and we need to look to ask for surveys and feedback from the centers that are using these guidelines. How are they using it, not using it? What are the problems? And the testing the capability of these guidelines in supporting the diagnosis and early management of patients with inborn errors of immunity. And again, this will be through the registry data collection and feedback from centers and from patient organizations. And then back on the subject on development of the African registry. So I would like to share some of the, so I think, no, this is, sorry. So I will share this first. So again, as I said, Monica Easter and Dr. Ali Sobhi, they did like an Excel sheet in order to be able to gather information about in order to be able to gather information about inborn errors of immunity. This is how the African inborn errors of immunity registry should appear. So we have multiple sheets. So the sheet 1 is just data on the center. Sheet 2 will be on clinical criteria. Sheet 3 will be on investigations. And sorry, I think there is a problem in the sheets, how they are moving. And then the final sheet will be on the established diagnosis, if there is a genetic diagnosis or no genetic diagnosis. And I think the challenge is about doing this is funds. So there is a budget work items for the first year. So we need IT supports, we need maintenance for data management, and the total budget for this was 45,000 USD. Of course, with the inflation, everything will be much more than this if the inflation continues in the same way. And Dr. Monica Isar has been in contact with different sponsors to see if they can sponsor this activity and developing the registry. And I think, I'm sorry that I'm doing it this way, but I think the other challenge is, which is a big challenge more than money, I would say, is momentum and education. So we need people to move forward, to be keen to work on this. And I know that at the beginning, every one of us is very enthusiastic about doing the project. And then after some time, people will lose momentum. And it is important that we feel, even if there are hurdles, if there are obstacles, that yes, we can do it, and we are keen to establish this. And the other thing is education, like we need to educate doctors in different centers about inborn errors of immunity. We need to make more schools for inborn errors of immunity. We need to guide them to join ESEED, to be members of ESEED as well, and to be joining the schools that ESEED are creating, not just the African Society schools, so they have good exposure for in their training for patients with inborn errors of immunity. And this is one of the registry that is present. And I'm really grateful for my colleague, Professor Monica Isar, for sending this to me. So this is the South African registry that was established in 2006. And in this registry, there are 336 patients. And most of the patients, the most common presentations, 59% of the patient is respiratory infection. Consanguinity, interestingly, was very rare, only from North African immigrants, but family history was positive in 28% of the patients, and antibody deficiency was the most common diagnostic criteria in 41% of the cases. There are IVIG, accessibility to IVIG, and there is some accessibility to subcutaneous immunoglobulin therapy. So similar to the data that we get from the South African registry, and I know that Professor Busfiha, they have also the Moroccan registry, we need to see how there is differences between different countries. What is the most common inborn error of immunity in different countries, whether in North Africa, South Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa, and what is the accessibility to treatment, and how can we get funds and charity support for the centers that do not have access to medical treatment. And for this, I would acknowledge my colleague from the African Inborn Error of Immunity Working Party, and I would, and also from the Advisory Review and the Asset Board. And I would say that I would be grateful if you want to join the African Inborn Error Working Party, to email me or my colleague, Dr. Ryan Gouda, and the emails are below, so that you can join us and we can work together, and hopefully this will make a change.